Most movie genres have relatively clear definitions. Audiences can expect horror films to be frightening, often through the use of gore and/or jump scares, while rom-coms are light-hearted tales of lust and love that feature a dose of humour. But not all genres are quite so clearly defined, as is the case with the so bad it's good categorisation. Simply put, these are films which manage to be so bad that they actually become good, or rather, enjoyable. But what constitutes bad and enjoyable is obviously subjective, and so this genre can only ever be loosely defined. To some people, a particular so bad it's good movie might actually just be a good movie, while to others, it might be unwatchable trash. There are a few standout examples from this genre. Tommy Wiseau's The Room from 2003, Troll 2 from 1990, and basically the entirety of Ed Wood's filmography. All of these examples are so famous for their enjoyable badness that they've inspired documentaries and biographical films which delve into their origins and legacies. It might not seem hard to sum up the shared features of these films. There's the very crap or over-the-top acting, clunky scripts with strange dialogue, poor special effects, and bizarre plot points that defy logic. They're often low budget, but not always, and they tend to be described with words such as campy, cheesy, and schlocky. So that's the shallow dive into these films, but there's actually a lot to dig into with this strange and yet beloved genre, and so I present to you a potentially unnecessarily thorough deep dive of the so bad it's good genre. In the 2022 book Why It's Okay to Love Bad Movies, Matthew Strahl, a philosophy professor at the University of Montana, splits this genre into two categories: bad movie ridicule and bad movie love. With bad movie ridicule, quote, good means something like ripe for mockery. So bad it's good means that an artwork is bad, but that one still enjoys watching it, not because one judges that it's aesthetically valuable, but because one enjoys making fun of it, end quote. For me, an example of this kind of movie would be the Twilight movies, which are laughably bad from start to finish. From Edward calling Bella a spider monkey and then running through the forest with her on his back in the first film, to the nightmare-inducing CGI baby in the last film, the Twilight saga is shot through with badness. But while this film falls into the ridicule category for me, for others it may fall into the other category Strahl outlines, which he calls bad movie love. In this category, quote, so bad it's good means that one recognises that there is some limited sense in which the movie is bad, but that one ultimately judges it to be aesthetically valuable, in part because it's bad in this limited sense, end quote. An example of this kind of movie for me would be Hawk the Slayer, which features some delightful overacting, a medieval synth-pop score, and some very funny low-budget special effects. When I'm laughing at this film's badness, it doesn't feel like mockery. Really, this type of movie shouldn't be described as so bad it's good. Instead, it should be so bad it's funny or so bad it's enjoyable. The categories Strahl sets out are less about the movies themselves and more about how a person views and experiences the movies. I also don't think these categories are always totally separate, but they're a good basis for understanding why people enjoy watching certain bad films. Years before the so bad it's good descriptor became popular, this type of movie was often referred to as camp. Susan Sontag's 1964 essay, Notes on Camp, is the usual starting point when defining the camp aesthetic. She writes that, quote, the essence of camp is in its love of the unnatural, of artifice and exaggeration, and later says that the whole point of camp is to dethrone the serious. Camp is playful, anti-serious, end quote. Simply put, camp is about artificiality, silliness, and excess. Of course, this quality doesn't always mean that something is bad. There are plenty of critically acclaimed films which utilise camp elements. Sam Raimi's Evil Dead films, for instance, are infused with a humorous and theatrical brand of horror that is regularly defined as campy. Another example is the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which is all about over-the-top theatricality. Plus, Tim Curry's character, Dr. Frankenfurter, is linked to the queerness that has historically been at the heart of camp. Sontag points out that, quote, homosexuals by and large constitute the vanguard and the most articulate audience of camp, end quote. However, since the 60s, camp has definitely spread its wings and taken flight beyond queer circles. Paul Baker, in his 2023 book Camp, The Story of the Attitude That Conquered the World, dives much deeper into what camp is, where it came from, and how it developed. He writes that, quote, in the last 100 years or so, camp has become an increasingly important part of popular culture, particularly as the status of queer people has improved in many parts of the world, end quote. Just think, there's only a 40-year difference between the Stonewall riots in 1969 and the start of RuPaul's Drag Race in 2009. In the 60s, camp culture in this queer context was still mocked by the mainstream, sometimes to the point of violence. And yet, less than half a century later, glamorously over-the-top drag queens were starring on TV. This camp quality, while often present in films that are largely regarded as good, is often also a major defining factor in films that are so bad they're good. Take, for instance, the exaggerated silliness of 1997's Batman and Robin, a film that is outright loathed by many comic book fans. I definitely understand the disdain for this movie at the time. Audiences were hungry for a more serious take on superheroes, and this film offered up George Clooney in a batsuit with hilariously prominent nipples, along with many low-effort ice puns from Arnold Schwarzenegger's Mr. Freeze.
Kick some ice. What killed the dinosaurs? The Ice Age! Stay cool, bird boy. All right, everyone. Chill. Chill.
Kevin Feige, the president of Marvel Studios, described Batman and Robin as, quote, the most important comic book movie ever made. It was so bad that it demanded a new way of doing things. It created the opportunity to do X-Men and Spider-Man, adaptations that respected the source material and adaptations that were not campy. End quote. Feige explicitly points to campness as one of the reasons the movie is bad, but time and an abundance of films which offer dark and serious takes on superheroes has allowed Batman and Robin to enter so bad it's good territory. The film revels in being silly and over the top, and this campy aesthetic proves to be far more fun to watch than many of the mediocre and joyless superhero films that are being pumped out these days. Sure, the film isn't a masterpiece, but it makes for some fun viewing on a Saturday night with friends. It's been pretty well established that humour serves as a bonding tool for humans, and this is definitely one of the aspects of the so bad it's good genre. These films are best enjoyed in company, be that with a friend on the sofa or in a cinema full of like-minded enthusiasts. Batman and Robin is also a great example of the viewer's perception changing the experience of watching the film. I don't dispute the fact that Batman and Robin was straight up bad in the late 90s, but viewing the film at a later date and through a different lens changes it. At the time, it seemed like an insult, but looking at it now, it can be seen as a sincere but misguided attempt to make a good film, which unintentionally led to it becoming comedic and thus so bad it's good. This combination of sincerity from the filmmaker and the right outlook from the audience is crucial to what makes so bad they're good films work. In the journal article So Bad It's Good, The Room and the Paradoxical Appeal of Bad Films, Mark Hy Knudsen and Matthias Claesson argue that, quote, a filmmaker then has to be perceived as attempting to make a film within the classic Hollywood paradigm, in order for that film's violations of classic Hollywood norms to strike us as inadvertently humorous as opposed to self-consciously subversive, and thus deserving of critical thought and reflection instead of laughter. End quote. So first off, to appreciate a bad film, you need to have a good grasp on the conventions of standard filmmaking. Films don't exist in a vacuum, and it's the way bad films contrast against typically good films that makes them so funny/enjoyable to watch. Take, for instance, Luke's reaction to being told that Darth Vader is his father in The Empire Strikes Back.
No. It's not true.
Mark Hamill does a great job of portraying disbelief and anguish here. Contrast that with this scene from Troll 2, where the guy being turned into a plant realises that he's about to become goblin food.
Oh my God!
Hollywood also sets the norm for what audiences consider to be good special effects, whether they're practical or CGI. In Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the scene near the end where Walter Donovan drinks from the wrong cup and then rapidly ages was done using both practical makeup and visual effects, and it still looks pretty creepy today. In contrast, the face morphing scene from Sleepwalkers just a few years later is laughably bad.
What the fuck?
As for being inadvertently humorous rather than self-consciously subversive, So Bad They're Good films are in a relatively unique position in the world of media. In an essay titled The Death of the Author, Roland Barthes convincingly argues that the meaning of a literary text is not defined by authorial intention, but rather by audience interpretation. Quote, "To give a text an author is to impose a limit on that text, to furnish it with a final signified, to close the writing. And so the birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author." End quote. Although the subject of debate, most English literature academics would agree with this sentiment, but I think it uniquely doesn't apply to So Bad They're Good movies. These movies absolutely depend upon audience interpretation to be enjoyable, but authorial intention, or at least perceived authorial intention, is integral to an audience's reaction to these films. If the director is deliberately trying to be funny by breaking standard film conventions, then it comes off as disingenuous and try-hard. I'm looking at you, Sharknado. Films that are trying to be purposefully bad usually end up feeling soulless. The Sharknado films and others like it feel cynical and as if they're trying to capitalise on a trend without putting the work in. To be eligible for the So Bad It's Good label, a film needs to have sincerity. Part of the joy of watching these types of movies comes from the filmmaker's attempt and then failure to execute an artistic vision. So I've established that sincerity and unintentional humour lies at the heart of the So Bad It's Good genre. Troll 2 is a great case study to demonstrate this, partly thanks to the documentary about the film called Best Worst Movie. Troll 2 is known for being ridiculous and nonsensical, but this documentary reveals that director Claudio Fragasso didn't see the film that way.
Che su cose molto gravi, molto importanti, come mangiare, vivere, morire, parla della famiglia, dell'unione di una famiglia, del senso di una famiglia contro tutti quelli che la vogliono vedere morta.
In an interview with Vice, Michael Stevenson, who plays the son in Troll 2 and directed the documentary, perfectly sums up why the film works so well. Quote, "There's no sense of irony in it at all, and that's refreshing. You can feel the heart of the filmmaker at its core. There's somebody behind this who is really trying to make a great movie. It's still an eminently watchable film, but it makes no sense, and there are all sorts of logic flaws, and the effects are terrible, and the acting is weird. It feels like aliens made it on another planet as a representation of what they thought humans acted like." End quote. It should also be noted that good breaking of classic film conventions can exist within bad movies. With acting, for instance, it's already been established that it's not necessarily bad to give an over-the-top performance that plays into the camp side of things. Jeremy Irons in Dungeons & Dragons and Raul Julia in Street Fighter both seem to delight in chewing the scenery. Both of these performances are so much fun to watch, and they contrast brilliantly with the actually bad performances given by most of the other actors in their respective films. Scenes with both Irons and Thora Birch in Dungeons & Dragons are funny precisely because he's hamming it up, while Birch is reading her lines with as little emotion as humanly possible.
I ask you one last time, will you submit to the ruling of this council and relinquish your scepter?
I was praying that you would find the wisdom to see that the path I propose for Izmir is the right one.
So to close this video out, I'm going to recommend a few of my favourite movies in this weird little genre that haven't yet been mentioned. People may say that space is where horror franchises go to die, but I think Jason X and Leprechaun 4 in Space are hilarious. For those who like stories about little creatures causing havoc, check out Ghoulies and Critters 2: The Main Course. The first Critters is also decent, but I prefer the second. If it's big creatures that you like, then check out the sequels to Tremors. The first movie is, of course, just straight up good. The 1995 Mortal Kombat film makes a great companion piece to Street Fighter. For a more modern film, check out Malignant, which isn't the straightforward horror movie that you might think it is from the trailers. And for a little supernatural/fantasy horror, you can't go wrong with Warlock the Armageddon and Wishmaster. Happy viewing if you decide to watch any of the movies mentioned in this video, and thanks for watching.